Hi, today we want to share a panel discussion with you, which I recently had with some distinguished museum colleagues from around the globe, including Max Hollein from the Metropolitan Museum, Beatrice Leanza, Director of the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology in Lisbon, and Suhanya Raffel, who is the Director of the MAAT Museum in Hong Kong. And with those three wonderful colleagues, I discussed about the effect of the corona pandemic on the world of museums and on culture in general. The discussion happened on the occasion of an international museum conference called muscon, which the Vitra Design Museum is organizing annually as a kind of platform for museum directors and curators to discuss about common projects, about traveling exhibitions, and also about the future of museums in general. And each of those conferences also includes one panel session about one of the urgent themes for the museum world. So this time, obviously, it was about the corona pandemic, and we were discussing how we as museums and organizations can emerge stronger and better from the pandemic that we are currently experiencing. So I thought the discussion really included some interesting insights, and so that's why we wanted to share it with you. So please listen and enjoy.
The topics that we can discuss now are very widespread. I'm curious to hear what our three colleagues will have to say. It can I'd just like to sketch a little bit the panorama of things that can be included in that topic. It's first of all about safety measures that all our museums have implemented and that have a strong influence on how we are running our daily routines. It's affecting our activities. What can we still offer? How can we continue to offer educational activities, workshops, other formats that we can develop to allow further educational activities, maybe in online formats? The income situation of museums is changed. Of course, there is reduced income. Fundraising has changed. How can we deal with that situation in order to still generate income or balance the losses? There are staff issues. What does it mean for our staff if we work remotely? How can we keep up working on projects? What does it mean for the curating of new exhibitions? Then there are also issues of security for the collections. What happens with collections if there is a lockdown and staff is limited to guarantee the security? And last not least, what is the museum's voice towards politics? We notice that when there are lockdown situations, that a lot of stakeholder groups in society are starting to express their interest for their type of institution. Do museums have enough representation towards national cultural authorities to make themselves heard? And I think these are all questions that can appear in our discussion and also in the statements that we will now hear from our three colleagues. I would like to give the word now to Suhanya Raffel, the Director of MPlus from Hong Kong, to start with the first input statement about the topic of this theme session during muscon 2020, Museums in Times of Crisis, How to Respond and Rise to the Challenge. Please, Suhanya, the stage is yours.
Hello, good morning, good evening to all of you from different parts of the world. And thank you, Mateo, for inviting me and for hosting this session. I will say I'm going to provide some reflections rather than a statement, because it's very particular situation for us here in Hong Kong. And if I might have my first slide, it would be good to see it. Yeah, that's great. So we are in fact establishing and opening a major museum next year. And COVID, together with social and political upheaval in Hong Kong, have cast a very particular reality for the museum as we prepare for opening what will be the first global institution in this city, which is actually one of the great global cities in the world. So it feels like it's time that we opened an institution with that kind of reach. And it's been over 10 years in the making. And then to come to this particular point in time has been hugely challenging. So what are our reflections? I think what the environment of COVID has done is underscored the political divisions that were starting to be expressed last year. And we need to then respond as an institution in that context. And we continue to make programs, and we have a small pavilion in which we do exhibitions, but also we go out into the community, because what is very clear and important in Hong Kong is developing a museum going audience. So not only do we have a challenge of opening the museum, but we also have to develop a significant audience space as well for a museum of visual culture. So we have interests across design, architecture, moving image, and visual arts. I will say that the first clear reflection in terms of how to manage this challenge has been to think about partnerships and collaborations. That has been essential for us in this time, and partnerships and collaborations with our local communities. And this has been a very positive part of the incredibly challenging environment. It's made us sharper. It's brought a dynamism to our programming and thinking. And actually, change is about learning, change is about surviving, and intense change in Hong Kong is also an opportunity, and an opportunity to reflect on what does the institution mean. We have also thought a lot about our civic role as an institution in the city, a city of almost 8 million people that live in dense vertical and very small spaces. And this museum is a purpose-built institution from the ground up, designed by Swiss architects, and the spaces are incredibly generous. And that is, we are thinking very carefully about what that offers as a gift to people who usually don't have a built environment that is generous and open. So we're thinking of the museum then also in this terms of challenge. The response is to think about the museum as a place of respite, of slowing down, thinking about relevance, making sure that our voice is relevant, and to recognize the diversity of our city, which has many different layers, which also includes in a business as usual year, a transitory visitorship of 56 million people. So we are 7 million people, and in any year we bring in 56 million mainland Chinese visitors and 80, and then that's topped up by a further 30 million of international visitors. It's the most visited city in the world. So we then think about what does diversity, what is relevance, what does slow time and reflection then also mean for museum at this time. I would also like to say that finally, if I can go to my next slide, is an exhibition that is currently on at the pavilion, which is the return exhibition of, shall it say, the exhibition that we take to Hong Kong for Venice, of Hong Kong's lateral presentation at Venice Biennale. And I wanted to show you this work because the work is called Negotiated Differences. And we developed this, of course, long before COVID, long before the protest environment. And she is a Hong Kong artist living in Los Angeles, working with wood turning and 3D printing. And the entire piece of sculpture, and it's a very rhizomatic, site-specific work that is based on traditional furniture making techniques out of East Asia, which means every element is tied together through balance and locking in. There are no pins, there's no glue. But it also means that the entire piece of work, if one piece comes undone, it comes down, it collapses. And so then we have to spend time putting it back together, which we had to do twice in Venice and once in Hong Kong, just because of the way people move through the work. But it felt like a very apt piece of art for our times right now. Negotiated difference, a work about interconnectedness and about balance, and a need to think always about a moving reality, that things that might settle at one point will unsettle and will need to be resettled again. So in thinking about the reflections of how do we respond, how do museums respond in times of crisis, is also listening to the work of artists, designers, makers. They often suggest very important solutions as we move forward. Finally, I wanted to talk about money and finances and fundraising and how we have responded right now to this particular moment. We have been very lucky that we were not open, and at a time when we are actually powering up to open a very large museum, 65,000 square meters with 17,000 square meters of display space, we were able to pull back on the staffing of our museum without having to lose staff. Now that is a really that's a very positive thing for us, and not necessarily the reality for other institutions. But we were able to do that because we knew that economically we had to really slow down. We've slowed down our exhibition programs, major exhibitions that were being planned as part of the museum's opening sequence. We also decided to really think about sustainability and freight. Freight is a huge cost for us to move things around, and decided that we would really turn to the region. We would look to collaborations and partnerships in the region and work together with our collections and share in that form. And this has brought us closer together. I think one of the things that I will end with, because I know it's it's a short 10 minutes, I think I have another couple of minutes, is to say that this particular COVID has brought the museum community much closer together. And I think the fact of today, this conference, deciding to meet virtually, on one hand is very sustainable. It means we don't travel in the same way. And I think that's good for the environment. It has meant also that we are more alert to each other and more open and honest with each other. And I think that's great. But it also means that we need to really think about, if we are doing the big blockbusters, the big major exhibitions, and are investing in significant money in freight and so on, who our audience is and how we are bringing those people together. We think a lot about that into the future. But I guess my advantage is because I haven't been open this year, thank goodness. And we will open probably this time next year, our fall in 2021. And we will think about the opening timeline given COVID. We have definitely put in place very significant safety measures. And in fact, because we were right in the early days, and I sit on the CMAM board, Singapore National Gallery and M+, we put together safety requirements about temperature, about mask wearing, about one-way routing, managing social distancing. And I remember in March having a board meeting and discussing these with colleagues, and our many colleagues all over the world said, oh no, we can never ever do that. Within 1 month, we were revisiting and we put up those very same guidelines to museum colleagues around the world, because it is now our new normal right now until we know how to deal with this pandemic. So I think I'll stop there because it's time for Max and Beatrice to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suhanya. That was very insightful, and I think there are already a few topics that we can discuss later. Now I would like to hand over to Max Hollein, Director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to hear his comments on the current situation. Max, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Mateo.
Hi.
I'm here. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And it was great to hear also what Suhanya had to say. I don't have any slides. I want to just give a couple of comments on where I would see museums in general being in what place they are right now and how we try to navigate what we see in front of us. I would like to basically maybe even kind of continue what Suhanya said about a couple of topics. One, I clearly see a big risk for museums, especially for museums of our kind, global museums, museums that have an encyclopedic idea that basically are very international in nature. I think we see through the pandemic an acceleration of trends that we have seen already before that, which are now even kind of surfacing even more. And what I mean with that is, I think the nationalism is obviously on the rise, now more than ever. Borders have been put up where there were no borders before because of the pandemic, but it's basically also for other purposes. Travel restrictions are in place. Xenophobia is an outcome not only of the pandemic, but has been with us, but is again accelerated right now. I think the role of the museum and the role of the encyclopedic museum is exactly about all of that, to counter all of that, to be kind of on the opposite side of nationalism, xenophobia, borders, and all of that. So I think our role in sending a global, international message and being part of a global international dialogue is now more important than ever. So I think that's for us one of the guiding principles actually moving forward. And our programming, our activity, where we want to be active, what we want to support, how we will be together with our colleagues, that's going to be one of our guiding principles. The other thing that I want to mention is also I would say our institutional role as a US institution. The USA has been a champion of human rights, was considered a beacon of liberty and justice for all these kind of values that people kind of associate with the United States, and why they love also this country, why they want to kind of have that country be in the forefront, also in a global dialogue. I think that kind of has suffered in the last couple of months, if not years. So again, I think the role of the MAAT is really to be an important ambassador of that, to be really, it is an institution that is built on these values. So I think now more important than ever for us, it is to project these values and to be very respectful of these values and be a really, in that sense, truly institution that fosters that. Thirdly, I think we all see right now, especially also in the US, a reckoning with history and an analysis of the current and of the shortcomings of institutions and the failures of institutions in many aspects. So the MAAT as a memory institution needs to address that in multiple ways. Not only about the history of the MAAT, but also how we in general deal with history. And how history will be, so to say, narrated and projected forward. So the MAAT will be one of the institutions to show that the complexity of history and storytelling narratives, but also the complexity about being an institution in the current time and what we can do to make to be really a responsive and a responsible institution. Lastly, I want to say that another trend that we see, and I think that's fairly typical, or more typical even for American institutions than for European institutions where I also worked, is that audience is taking more and more ownership of the museum. And I think that's a great thing. And it basically means that an audience has the expectation that the museum really also represents the values of the audience and represents that in a broader context. So in a certain way, it's a much more collaborative model right now about how museums move forward, how museums develop, not so much only their programming, but also how they develop in general, and how much it's not only about being audience focused, but how participation of audience is basically one of the guiding principles moving forward. Changes that we have all seen are basically things that will also stay with us. So during this time of closure and lockdown, obviously an audience has developed on the digital arena that will stay with us, meaning that before, a lot of our digital tools were always kind of considered to be more for a certain kind of age group or for a certain generation. During the lockdown and during the time of closure, everybody learned to use all sorts of different digital tools to receive and to disseminate information. I think that's going to stay with us. This symposium or this talk is a perfect example for that. So I think both in regard to audience interaction, but also for scholarly purposes, we are entering a new arena also of accessibility and also of being able to convene and be in dialogue in a much more efficient and much quicker way. What we also experienced is the museum, the MAAT, has been closed for well, probably about 6 months. So coming back for our audience has been an enormous experience. And I think what is clear here is that people understood that coming to a museum is not something that they can take for granted. They've been missing something while it was not possible. So the audience right now is way more attentive than before. It's way more focused. It's way more kind of emotionally connected to the museum than before. And we want to keep that way. So we are working on kind of keeping that kind of almost like new intensity of a visit and an intensity of coming to the institution. What is obviously also happening, I think, in a lot of other cities as well, is that our audience has clearly changed right now and will continue to be that way in the next year or two, with tourism not really building up anytime soon in these major touristic cities like also Hong Kong, Rome, Paris, or New York. We have a primarily local audience right now, and that's going to stay with us. So it is, on the one hand, an issue, of course, in regard to total attendance and revenues. On the other hand, a huge opportunity for us to focus on a local audience that has a very different relationship with the institution. So programming will reflect that, and programming will be part of that. On the other hand, it means because people cannot visit us from abroad, we need to be internationally present and active, and we need to reach out in multiple ways so that we really fulfill our mandate of being a museum really also for the world. So you will see that in many different aspects, not so much only about exhibitions traveling, but really about us entering into dialogues and conversations all around the globe and being accessible there. In regard to programming, of course, I think it's the same what Suhanya said. We already see now almost like an increased collaborative spirit. A programming, of course, at the beginning of when we are now reopened, that's way more collection based. We will have a very ambitious program lineup actually in the next couple of years. We've reduced the programming by about 40%, which basically at the MAAT means not 50 exhibitions, but 30. So it still is a huge amount of activity, but it's more focused, more thematically oriented, certainly more diverse, more complex even, probably from our, in regard to our programming. I mean, I think to finish this off, I think for us, it's really important to be a voice also in the cultural discussion of today, and to be seen as a museum that does not simply relive the past, but is a museum that lives in the present, reflecting also the past and our current time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. These were many different and very interesting aspects. I think you underlined some of the things that Suhanya mentioned about rediscovering the local audiences, rethinking the program policy, and I'm happy to take that up in our Q&A session later. Now I would like to hand over to Beatrice from Lisbon. Is she there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, hello Beatrice.
Hi, Mateo.
So, welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for making me part of this privileged conversation, I have to say. I will share 3 points, 3 things that I took from the experience of the past few months, and a few of others that we did, things that we took up at MAAT, what we did, like to counter these conditions. First of all, and continuing, of course, on aspects that both Max and Suhanya already mentioned. First aspect, while we have all been hit by the same phenomenon, this has brought up, quite a stunning, realization that for the staggering diversity that museums and institutions of culture, present for themselves in the world, we all live on the same business models, and so we are all hit, in the same way. The fact that the repercussions and the way that we will have to live up to these changes are different. So sure, tourism, event making, transnational commuting, these are things that are not going to be, at least for a foreseeable future, at the same level or at the same rate. And regardless of a smaller, a scaled institution like MAAT, or perhaps, a big institution in New York or in a global city like Hong Kong, these are phenomena that are affecting us all. So what does this mean, and what does this mean for museums? So because in this sense, so I suspect that there will be a new dynamism that will have to be put in place in what we understand the practices of localization and internationalization. So definitely, I like to think about this as a form of meaningful provincialism that somehow will have to, really force us to rethink the way that contextually, as institutions of culture, we serve and we are present for our communities. And our communities are different. They are different historically, demographically, and they have reacted over the past few months very differently to this, though common phenomenon. So sure, we all have in place probably similar rules in, accepting audiences, in museums, wearing masks, or timed ticketing, and et cetera, But the point is that these repercussions have already deeply transformed our social behaviors and economic decisions. And these are factors that we have to keep in mind. Also, I think that whatever is now the very heated conversation, particularly in certain parts of the world, like in the States, which is on the accountability and responsibilities of institutions, is nothing new. Like many other things that, COVID has put on all of us, is not creating anything new. It's just accelerated or brought to the fore phenomena that were already there. And this issue on what really is the role and what are the responsibilities of institutions of culture in the 21st century, it's something that I've been very much at the center of these conversations, with colleagues for the past few years. So what to do with that? And the third thing is that I really believe that a paramount change and challenge that we will all equally face is how to is in our storytelling capacity, because I do believe that of course we have experienced it as well. There was definitely an emotional, desire for returning to the museum, for returning actually to social life, of which institutions are a part. But the issue here is, how are we going to deal with the fact that the encounter with artifacts is no longer going to be a primary, undertakings, you know, for institutions. So what we did at MAAT in the past few months is first, I really pushed very hard to be able to reopen. Keep at all costs, try to keep your institutions open, make them be there for your community in whatever capacity. I think that this is a first rule. Because there is a new relationship that we have to instate with our audiences. And part of this is going to be, how do we put in place really this so-called digitalization or digital transition for audiences? I don't believe that creating digital doubles for whatever museums do, putting exhibitions online is going to be enough. If we want to be meaningfully contributing to this conversation of what the digital ecosphere means for our being together, being social, being civic, we need to do more. Because we are asked to be more, regardless of the fact that we are privately owned or publicly owned or mixed, whatever kind of institutions, we still serve a public role. So what we did with MAAT is that, interestingly, we had already planned a project that I presented earlier on during my 10-minute slot that really transformed the museum as a sort of temporary civic arena. And what we did, unlike what I have read a lot happened instead in other institutions, but I hope this is going to be part of the conversation perhaps after, is that we have not let go of any of the public and educational programming that we had. So what we did was instead really put ourselves on a learning curve on what it would mean to be operating in a hybrid modality of being present online, of being present offsite in both ways, because this is going to be a learning curve on top of being, of course, a financial, you know, like matter. So this was really, and it's being really useful, this way of prototyping. How can we not only learn ourselves, but accustom our audiences to this way of living and being with the museum? So part of this was also like the launch of a new platform. We launched in mid-September, we launched a new digital platform called MAAT Extended. This is, well, it's a website. You can, you know, click and see it. It's not though either a journal or an editorial space. It's literally the beginning, the prelude of a digital space. That's why it's called MAAT Extended. So it is an extension of the museum in the digital sphere to really kind of become an ecosystem through which the museum can operate on top of what it already does. And I don't know how far, you know, how I'm faring with time, but I think that it would be, for me, it'd be interesting also to hear, you know, like from you, how you know, like you believe this can really transform institutional collaboration to the level where first we have to be much more mindful about our ecological footprint. Exhibitions are expensive and really polluting enterprises. So can we stop overproducing in this sense, keep on longer shows, and actually do something else together that can be based more on perhaps knowledge transfer, skill set, you know, built up, upskilling, and a different way of perhaps creating new, you know, tools, either digital or otherwise, that can really sort of create a new future for the way that, you know, institutions of culture can continue being present for their communities and remain relevant. I think I'll stop here. Maybe we can, you know, commence the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for that very intense input with, again, a lot of further thoughts and inspirations. Maybe let's continue with one of the last aspects you mentioned, which was about the extension of your activities online and your advice to, or your own strategy to, you mentioned at all cost. Curious what that means, keeping on all the activities, all the educational formats, and you know, maybe probably a lot of colleagues have experienced that something like that can be difficult with a lot of restrictions imposed, with audience that is skeptical about security issues, etc. But I completely understand what you mean by showing that the institution is vital, that things continue, that there is an offer for people who are longing for community, for social gatherings to the audiences. Maybe addressing that question to Max and Suhanya, how have you dealt with that issue that on the one hand, audiences were going down and also restrictions made it difficult to offer activities, but still you wanted to continue offering certain formats. Max, you have huge programs of educational offers, and I wonder how this can be kept up, at least partially, because this is part of how you are rooted in your local communities.
Right. Yes, I think we have always had a very strong digital presence, but and we also followed, I would say, a kind of a strategy that also Beatrice kind of alluded to. That, I mean, certainly digital doesn't mean kind of just replicating or trying to replicate the physical experience, but really being something that is just like a wider definition of what a museum and what it does as an educational and as an engaging institution. We wanted to make sure that whatever we do and whatever we kind of add on to our digital programming during this time of lockdown or closure, we wanted to make sure that all of that stays with us after the time. So none of it was meant to be just for that time. I think we wanted to kind of build on new programs, new offerings, new audiences, and that we then carry that forward. And it's basically a major expansion of the institution during this time of closure. So that will stay with us for sure. It's really an effort to further expand the idea of the museum being an educational and engaging institution and being accessible throughout the world, but also being able to have a local voice in other parts of the world. So the idea of locality is very important, but I think it would be a super misunderstanding if we would define that, okay, we need to be a New York institution. We need to be an institution that's also very accessible and involved in India, in South Korea, and other places where we have strong holdings in our collection about that. So for us, it's really important to have that development. The one other thing that I would want to say is that we are looking at way more possibilities now than before about actually using other platforms to disseminate our content, our offerings, our engagement. So while we have built our own very strong platform, I think what's much more interesting for us right now is actually to partner with other major digital platforms to be not only a content provider, but actually use them to disseminate some of our offerings. And that's something that we are pursuing, I would say, vigorously around the world right now.
So I think in that case, the pandemic again has fostered something, an evolution that already took place before the pandemic, right? Which is to extend the museum digitally, but again, we were suddenly forced to do that. And I think it's also, this conference is a proof for that we suddenly discovered that also the tools we are using can be very quickly extended and more sophisticated if they have to be. One other aspect which I would like to mention or to speak about is also happening a little bit more behind the scenes of the institutions, because now we were looking about what we are offering to the audience, how we are programming, but there's also the issue of how the museum is operating internally, with people having been in lockdown for several weeks or several months, depending on which country. And you know, the question of remote work has a big topic in all kinds of cultural and economic life. What were your experiences with a part of your staff, or probably also big parts of your staff, working from home on ongoing projects? How have you dealt with that situation when it was most pressing in the first weeks of the lockdown?
Maybe I'll jump in,
Yes,
because
please.
we were right in the beginning of that cycle. We found that working from home became, because we've had 3 phases of that. We've had 3 opportunities to explore working from home. We also knew that we had to divide into teams, because we can't do everything from home. We have to do some things on site. Conservation needs conservation labs to work in and so on. So we divided ourselves into teams, and we would rotate. It also became very clear that the social contact is essential. And we all, of course, worked on Zoom and Teams and became very adept at that. But that said, to get back to work, especially in the Hong Kong situation where most people live in very small spaces with very many other people, the work space is also a refuge from other pressures. That became very clear to my personal workforce in Hong Kong situation. This may be reflected in other parts of Asia where there's density, whether it's Tokyo or mega city like Shanghai or Beijing. So that was a clear bottom line for us in terms of how we managed working and mental well-being, because it's the health of our staff became something that we were very concerned about, and we still talk about, because it's not over, and we know that we have to manage this into the future.
Thank you, Suhanya. There is a question from Catherine Laporte from Design Museum in Ghent, who is going into a direction which I also wanted to take in my next question. It's regarding politics. Of course, politics is taking decisions, and sometimes very strict decisions in these times. And I would be interested to hear from you whether you felt supported by your local authorities, by the possibility of entering in a dialogue with politics. And Catherine is asking, how do we dialogue with or convince politics about slow programming, less blockbuster exhibitions, less own income? So how do we deal with them? One thing is, how do we deal with them in a time when it's about measures and lockdowns and closing museums? And the other is a more long-term question. How do we renegotiate a new deal with cultural authorities to support museums on a long-term basis?
Can I jump in?
Please, Beatrice, yes.
Well, the point is that why does slow programming means necessarily slow, like no income? So I think that the issue here is that first, like we're different institutions. We are different models of institutions with different scales and different types of actions. So the solutions and the reactions to this cannot be a blanket solution for everyone, right? But I agree with one side, we're going back to the digital, digital transition or whatever, is that, yes, it's an issue of dissemination and it's an issue of new alliances. So it's not about how do we try to reinstate, like that flux, that possibility and etc. Because there are also behavioral patterns about, communities and society that we cannot predict. I can tell you, for example, that Lisbon was really badly hit by it during the pandemic and in the summer, more than in this, summer of the Olympics of geopolitical retaliation that was, the EU, like dealing with travel corridors and etc. Portugal was really badly affected, more than other countries. The place was empty. I mean, it was in Lisbon that I hadn't seen, like ever. So more than in other places, because I had a chance to be in France and in Spain for a short time, and I couldn't tell the difference. So there is this, I think, element of unpredictability. The other point is, who are the stakeholders that you need and want to bring into your institution? Because you have a choice. If you are a director, if you are at the head of your institution, you have a choice to, or an opportunity, let's say, to change that conversation. So my case is we are a privately owned museum. So it doesn't mean that my conversation is easier. If anything, if anything. It's a little bit more complicated. But I believe that we have really tried to embrace this flexibility. And what happened in the past few months was that because of the pandemic, this opened up conversations with other entities in the city, entities that were, for example, publicly funded, that had no venues, that had no, place to go. So what we did, partly with our, curators, in conversation, with different people in the city, we became home to these initiatives that would have remained otherwise orphans. But what happens is that opens up, like a different way of, wiring the system. So I think that, I don't know in each city, the level of imbrication of the institution, like in the context. For us, it's been useful in a sense that it has also created a different expectation and capacity to attract new audiences, so audiences that MAAT didn't have before. And this is, of course, adding up to making us, capable of creating new offers and reacting differently or working with different, like counterparts. So I think if anything, this is the perfect moment to go and talk to your stakeholders and tell them the game's gotta change. This is the best time to do it. Don't wait. If you want to do it now.
Max, do you agree?
I think I totally agree. I think also I would say what second what Beatrice was saying. I think it's also a responsibility of each institution. I just kind of reporting from our side. Of course, the MAAT is a private museum. It's a major public institution, but we are privately funded. There was no governmental mandate for us to close the institution. We were the first cultural institution probably that decided in New York to close, to be a responsive institution for the safety of our audience and our staff. And kind of that basically then triggered a different kind of public reception. So I think that especially in a time like this, institutions need to lead. They need to lead the conversation. They need to lead the idea for the future. And I think the big advantage, of course, is that, and I'm trying to get back to what I said during my statement, that while institutions were closed, so many people noticed how important museums are for their life and what is missing right now. So basically, there is no better moment right now to kind of negotiate or renegotiate whatever you want to kind of achieve or where you see yourself going. I think that's the moment to do it right now. I wouldn't want to rely on politics or politicians to come up with the path. I think we need to lead that, and it's and again, it's different for each institution depending on the particular structure and size. But I think that there's a huge opportunity and momentum there right now.
Thank you, Max.
May I just add that
yes.
I come from a situation where I have to intersect very clearly with government and politicians, and in a situation where the institution is of a scale and magnitude that they have never seen or understood. So I feel that the efforts that we do are always pioneering ones, and the online presence for the museum, in fact, it is a prelude to the physical one. So we've developed a lot of online material much earlier in any case, before we're moving in and opening the museum next year. But I do agree with what Beatrice said, is that slowing down is not necessarily stopping us doing the necessary work of programming for audiences, but also income generating. It doesn't, one doesn't stop the other at all. And in fact, it's made us think more carefully about digging into the collection, being much more alert with collaborations and partnerships, and really expanding that. That's been a real plus, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Suhanya. There is a last question from David Grossman from the International Council of Design. He writes, exactly what crisis is being considered, ? This is not a virus crisis. and certainly not a museum crisis. This is a global human crisis involving human evolution as reflected in social tensions, overconsumption, sustainability, and the need for resilience. Designing, so we speak about design here, designing has much to do with finding solutions, and designers are complicit in many of the causes. A post-COVID new normal that is merely a virus-proofed old normal would be a terrible waste of a crisis. How can museums contribute to a new understanding of designing? So that's David Grossman's question. It's a big question, but maybe it's a nice question for a final statement of each of you. Maybe starting again with you, Suhanya.
I agree, it's an opportunity, and we should not go back to bad habits and old habits just because that was something we are used to. I will say that it's we are still working it out. I don't have solution to that, but I actually think it's about making commitments institutionally that our sustainable footprints, we pay attention to that. The fact that we are traveling much less, that is a good thing. How do we make that a sustaining long-term thing while still participating in an international global dialogue, which I think is vital in a situation like Hong Kong, which, like I advocate for a cosmopolitan internationalism. It's an essential part of being thoughtful and responsive in a time when it's very easy to be xenophobic and the walls going up, because that's what the virus is making us do, is put those walls up. So yes, I don't have solution, but I think we do think about the orientation of the institution to be outward looking, open, future, and thinking what that future looks like, while at the same time being responsible about that positioning.
Thank you, Suhanya. Beatrice, what would you answer David?
I would say that the items that he's brought into the list are not new items, and that they were always there on the agenda, and they've been a long time. And briefly, I would say that there are plenty of areas of action that museums, where the museums can play a role, because we are actively social spaces, if not political places too. But I also think that one has to act in the knowledge of what is possible, what is, sizable and impactful. So pick carefully, like the agendas or the topics or the stories that you want to tell, and choose carefully the stories that you want to champion, but and make them matter. So I think it's my approach would be, I can't take them all. I mean, there's plenty of museums can take up on, the colonizing practices, gender studies or civic rights, politics of freedom. I mean, there are so many of urgent questions we have. For us, we have decided to go through, let's say, invest more into everything that is what we cap the environmental quest with our programming, with our, either educational, public or otherwise. So I think it's a matter of choosing the causes or the topics that you can dedicate, like resources to, because we can't do all. And because institutions matter, I agree, museums matter in this, then choose well.
Thank you, Beatrice. Max, do you have something to add to these statements, or also to the question that we just heard? So what it means for the role, what can we contribute to solve this crisis if we are not looking only at our museum role, but at society in general?
Well, I think that it's perfectly right. Of course, this is not just a health crisis or a crisis of that kind of overcoming the virus. I think it's what happened during this time is basically, it's like a magnifying glass, and basically what surfaced through it are a lot of the different issues that we have in our current society, in our current globalized world. within a capitalist, sometimes organized environment. All of these things kind of bubbled up and will be stress tested. And to a certain extent, I think we as an institution are, of course, always also a mirror of that time, of that society, of that of our kind of being. So in that sense, we are complicit. And so we need to be able to address some of these questions with an urgency, because I mean, I'm going back to my initial statement, because I think that as institutions, we are of course cultural institutions, but on the other hand, we need to have a certain set of values that we can live and project. So the idea of course, questions of diversity, inequality, discrimination, all of these things, people are looking at us of basically, again, leading this kind of conversation, at least in the cultural arena. And I think that there's no way of us like moving forward in the pace that we've tried to address these matters in the past. I think there's a different level of urgency, a different level of expectation, and there are different ways how we are being pressured for doing that. And it has to do also with philanthropy shifting right now. Philanthropy looking at what are these institutions doing? Are they responsive to the matters of our time right now? And that's then the only way that I don't know, foundations are going to support us, etc. So there are different forces also that kind of help us put this in the forefront of our agenda.
Thank you very much, Max. I think that's a very good closing remark, and it's something that we're all experiencing, how also the interests and the focus of our stakeholders, supporters, audiences are changing with the time and with us as institutions. So we're coming to the end. Thank you so much to all of you for your inputs. I think it was a very inspiring and very important exchange.